of Nassau and Suffolk County's Long Island News Tonight with Ken Eckhart, Carol Papp, and the award-winning LI News team.
Good evening. I'm Chris Collora, sitting in for Ken Eckhart with this special edition of LI News Tonight. Back in the 1920s, the North Shore of Long Island gained the title of the Gold Coast. It was home of the wealthy and privileged lifestyle immortalized in the novel The Great Gatsby, when about 1,200 Gold Coast mansions dotted the North Shore. Today, only a handful of these magnificent mansions remain standing as a reminder of a memorable time in Long Island's history. Tonight, we'll visit a few of the surviving Gold Coast mansions and learn what's being done to preserve them.
I believe that few people were actually invited to these parties. They just went. They got into automobiles which bore them out to Long Island, and somehow they ended up at Gatsby's door.
Once upon a time, that's the way it was here on Long Island. And just like the narrator in the novel The Great Gatsby portrayed here in this 1974 movie adaptation, today we can only appreciate that fabled time in Long Island's past from a distance. It was an era of extravagance when wealthy New Yorkers built over 1,200 mansions that line the North Shore of Long Island from Kings Point to Northport.
But nobody wanted to spend their summers in New York City, and the most convenient, attractive place to go would be the North Shore of Long Island.
These mansions were used as weekend and summer retreats. The North Shore of Long Island offered a wide variety of activities, including boating, hunting, and polo.
You could be out here in less than an hour. You could take your boat. If you had a commuter yacht, a lot of the families commuted back and forth to Wall Street in the morning when they started to live out here all year round.
Most of these mansions were built on a massive size and scale. The wealthy owners could afford to hire the best.
You had the greatest architects, landscape architects, sculptors, painters, working on these houses.
Author and historian Paul Mattiunas says designer Wilson Eyre called it a unique time in American architecture.
He would take the best roof lines and the best materials and the best floor plans and combined a little bit of French, a little bit of English, a little bit of Italian, and work it into this sort of structure that's wholly an American style.
Long Island Gold Coast mansions copied a variety of architectural styles. Quandra Hall in Huntington was modeled after a French chateau, and Eagle's Nest in Centerport in a Moroccan style. Perhaps one of the most unusual Gold Coast mansions is Hempstead House in Sands Point, built back in 1912 in the style of a European castle.
At the time, it was one of the most opulent buildings here on the North Shore and in all of Nassau County. Out back here, there was an oceanfront casino that had an indoor swimming pool, bowling alley, as well as guest rooms.
And the mansion Clayton, now the Nassau County Museum of Art in Roslyn, was also built with extravagance in mind.
When the Fricks lived here, there was a ski slope. There were 2 tennis courts, a major swimming pool, a polo court, a ski lift, and an animal pen, sort of like a miniature zoo.
Another impressively built mansion is White Eagle in Old Westbury, now called the De Seversky Center at the New York Institute of Technology. The home is full of intricate and elegant design work that was typical of the time.
If you look at the moldings in the ceiling of our ballroom, I mean, that ceiling is carved plaster. You just don't see that anymore.
But for many, the partying came to an end with the stock market crash of 1929. And by the 1940s, the economic conditions of the time pretty much spelt an end to the building boom of these types of mansions along the North Shore. Over the next few decades, many of the remaining mansions were either destroyed or abandoned.
It had become out of fashion, and the kids didn't want these houses. They were too big to afford.
Many of the remaining properties were sold and subdivided.
Modern tract housing had come into effect. Levitt started building Levittown on the grounds of what was the Aviation Country Club, and people came back from the war. They needed a place to live. There was the baby boom generation, and so there was a lot more housing with the proximity to New York and the automobile and the railroad. Everything just sort of tumbled and urban sprawl took place.
While many of these mansions have been lost forever, some have fortunately been rescued and restored to their former Gold Coast luster. One mansion is Oheka Castle in Huntington, which remains the second largest private home ever built in the United States. Oheka Castle was the home of philanthropist banker Otto Kahn. Kahn was famous for throwing Gatsby-like parties in the mansion. After Kahn's death in 1934, his widow eventually sold off the house to the state sanitation department. It was then used by various agencies throughout the years until it was finally abandoned altogether in 1979. Oheka sat empty for several years, suffering fires, vandalism, and neglect.
Well, my first impression of Ohika actually was a little, it was awe-inspiring, but at the same time a little scary, because it was huge, and it was a complete wreck. So, and my father bought it in 1984, and we're all thinking, oh my God, what are you going to do with this?
Well, I always thought it could be restored. I didn't think how big a job was going to be to restore. I think I underestimated that.
Milius spent 25 years and over $30 million restoring the home. Today, Milius runs Ohika as a small luxury hotel and event venue. It offers guests a chance to experience what living in one of these Gold Coast mansions may have been like back in the heyday of the Gold Coast. And Otto Kahn's great-granddaughter agrees.
Again, it's amazing how all of this can bring to the current generation a better appreciation of architecture, structure, history, and a lifestyle that, you can only read about in books, but here at Ohika, you can live it for a moment.
To bring it back, it shows the grandeur, it shows the great lifestyles, it shows the commitment and the arts and culture of yesteryear. And by restoring it, you bring this back to people. You show them what times were like in many years ago.
We teach our children to recycle bottles and plastics and newspaper, and I think that children need to learn that old homes can be recycled as well.
Another reason that we wrote the book is to inspire people across America, especially in this economic time, to find creative ways, finding adaptive reuses that can preserve a building and have it serve a purpose in this modern day society.
A Muttontown mansion named Fairleigh faced almost certain destruction in the 1990s. Fairleigh was the home of George S. Brewster, heir to a Standard Oil fortune. The 46-room mansion was built in 1912. It was the home of the Brewster family through 1968, but after several sales, it was eventually abandoned as well.
The house was stripped of everything. There wasn't a doorknob left. The paneling was stolen. The pilasters in the living room were stolen. So it was really quite a shell. And I basically said, this house is going to be torn down.
But it wasn't. The mansion was rescued by new owners who decided to take on the challenge of restoring it.
I felt a very strong presence of how beautiful it once was.
And a lot of the restoration work was done by recreating the details from old photographs published in Town and Country magazine in 1918.
We ended up finding a company that replicated some of the original chandeliers, including the ones here in the living room. And all they had to go by were the dimensions of the room and the original photograph. Most people, if you stick them side by side, don't even see the difference between the two chandeliers. They're almost identical.
And the value of these old homes is now being taught to the next generation.
We learned about the history of Long Island, and one of the things we study is how Long Island was a very important affluent area during the Gold Coast. We learn all about the time when Long Island was an area of tremendous estates and how life was very different back then.
Another famous Gold Coast mansion, Westbury House at Old Westbury Gardens, built in 1906, is also preserved in a similar way.
Anything that's done, any repairs that need to be made to the house, we go through an exhaustive study of finding just the right materials to match as closely as we can what the original architects had in mind.
And the restoration of Quandra Hall in Huntington is following a similar pattern.
And the building and the property of 33 acres is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So that gives us all the guidelines towards the restoration, which is the Gold Coast era.
The mansions, I think, are something that's more attractive because a lot of people don't live in mansions today and don't get to see mansions, and this is a way of sharing in that legacy.
But despite the efforts at preservation, many of these aging estates are still being lost. The mansion Land's End in Sands Point, which was the inspiration for Daisy Buchanan's house in The Great Gatsby, is currently in danger of being ripped down by developers who want to subdivide the property.
Land has skyrocketed since 2001. These houses, even if they're worth, $3 or $4 million to reproduce, the land that they sit on is often 2 building lots because they're so spread out and so big.
Developers are buying up property and they think nothing of bringing these mansions down to build to suit, basically.
Long Island author Nelson DeMille wrote 2 books set in Gold Coast mansions. DeMille says literature has helped to preserve the mythic allure of these mansions.
Gatsby is definitely an inspiration, and I mentioned Gatsby in both books, Gold Coast and Gatehouse. And I pay homage to the book. You have to. You can read it today, and you can still understand that world. I mean, it was a beautiful period piece.
Many of these remaining Gold Coast estates are accessible to the public today as museums, parks, and event venues. And DeMille agrees keeping them as private homes is unlikely.
The second life of the house as a commercial venture, which is the only place, the only way you could really preserve these houses.
One of the most prominent is Eagle's Nest in Centerport, the William K. Vanderbilt II estate.
This room's an eclectic collection of Mr. Vanderbilt's travels. It includes everything from exotic butterflies and birds to weaponry and artifacts from the South Seas.
Rather than just giving it in his will to his children, he decided that he would give it to the county and that everything he had collected would be on view forever.
Zach Lemley is a graduate student studying historical preservation. He built the website oldlongisland.com, devoted to preserving the history of these mansions online.
You know, there's a lot there, especially from an architectural standpoint. Some of the greatest architecture that was ever built in this country. You know, and not enough people appreciate it, not enough people are aware of it, and I just wanted to do my part to, bring it to light.
In addition to saving these historic mansions, much of the nature surrounding the homes has also been preserved as parks and nature preserves. One famous example is the home of President Theodore Roosevelt, Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay.
It's just the nature surrounding the house that is just unbelievably unique. While you have this suburbs boom of Long Island, what you really need to understand, and what people will have to understand when they come here, is that this is the rural area of New York. And you still kind of get that feeling of the rural area of New York and how Long Island was. It's really a preservation of how it was, and how this home was, still even to that time period.
These are part of that Gatsby era that is such a part of our history, and to have them come down so that somebody can live by the water is a sin almost.
To lose these houses, we really lose something that's American history of architecture, American history of art, and also social history, and just something that can't be reproduced. The craftsmanship is lost today to really do this.
The Gold Coast mansions were indicative of a certain period in American history. And whether that was a good period or a bad period, whether you thought it was economically just, economically unjust, if we don't have the mansions to be there as a starting point for a discussion of what the history of the country meant, we'll be that much poorer in our understanding of the past.
We feel very strongly that that's very important to let the next generation know what America was about. And the Gold Coast of Long Island, it plays a huge part in American history, which is still very young, but it is our history. And the story needs to be told over and over so that people remember.
And many of these surviving Gold Coast mansions continue to be open to the public, so you too can visit them and experience what life in these mansions used to be like. And a new Gold Coast Mansion Alliance Preservation Group has been formed, dedicated to teaching the public about the history of these mansions. For more information about the group, you can check out their website at www.historiclongisland.com. And that's it for this special edition of NYIT's LI News Tonight. I'm Chris Collora. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again next time. Have a good night.